When we think about trade in the modern world, we often imagine a system built on cooperation, countries exchanging goods, building partnerships, and creating mutual prosperity through interconnected economies that depend on one another for growth and stability. It is a comforting idea, one that suggests trade brings nations closer together, reducing conflict and encouraging peace through shared interests. But what if this assumption is incomplete? What if, for some civilizations, trade has never been just about cooperation, but something far more strategic, something carefully designed to shape outcomes, influence behavior, and maintain power without direct confrontation? Because for much of its history, China has not viewed trade as a simple exchange of goods between equal partners, but as a tool embedded within a broader system of control, hierarchy, and long-term strategic thinking. And to truly understand this perspective, we must move beyond modern headlines and trade disputes, and instead look deep into the historical foundations that shaped how China understands power itself. Why does China often connect economic relationships with political influence in ways that seem different from Western expectations? And how did a system developed thousands of years ago continue to shape its strategic thinking even in today's globalized economy? To answer that, we must begin not with modern trade agreements, but with the worldview that defined China's place in the world. In ancient China, the idea of trade was never separated from the broader structure of world order, because within the framework of Tianxia, the world was not seen as a collection of equal states interacting freely, but as a hierarchical system with China at its cultural and political center, surrounded by other societies arranged according to their perceived closeness to civilization. Within this worldview, economic exchange was not simply about supply and demand or mutual benefit, but about reinforcing relationships of status and recognition, where foreign states did not approach China as equals engaging in open trade, but as participants in a system that required acknowledgement of China's central role. This meant that from the very beginning, trade was not neutral, it carried meaning, it reflected hierarchy, and it reinforced a structure in which economic activity was deeply connected to political order. This philosophical framework translated into a practical system of controlled exchange, often referred to as the tribute system, where access to China's markets was not freely available, but carefully regulated by the state in a way that ensured economic interactions also served political purposes. Foreign rulers sent official missions bearing tribute, and in return, they were granted the opportunity to trade, receive valuable goods, and gain recognition from the Chinese emperor, creating a system in which economic benefit was directly tied to participation in a structured diplomatic relationship. This arrangement allowed China to maintain strict control over the flow of goods, limiting who could trade, when they could trade, and under what conditions, effectively transforming trade from an open activity into a managed privilege that could be expanded or restricted, depending on the behavior of other states. In this way, trade became an instrument of governance, carefully integrated into a broader strategy of maintaining influence without the need for constant military enforcement. Over time, Chinese rulers came to understand a critical principle that would shape their long-term approach to power. Economic relationships create dependence, and dependence creates leverage. When neighboring states relied on access to Chinese markets, goods, or recognition, they became more likely to align their behavior with China's expectations, not because they were forced to do so through direct coercion, but because the cost of losing that relationship could be economically and politically damaging. This allowed China to influence outcomes in subtle but effective ways, rewarding compliance with continued access and benefits, while discouraging defiance through restriction or exclusion, creating a system where economic incentives guided political behavior. In this sense, trade functioned not just as an exchange, but as a mechanism of influence, one that could achieve strategic goals without open conflict. This approach to trade was deeply connected to a broader tradition of strategic thinking in Chinese history, where influence was often preferred over direct confrontation, and long-term positioning was valued more than short-term victories. Ideas reflected in works like The Art of War emphasized that the highest form of strategy is to achieve one's objectives without fighting, by shaping the environment in such a way that outcomes naturally favor your position. Trade, within this framework, becomes a powerful tool not because it forces others to act, but because it creates conditions in which certain choices become more attractive than others, guiding behavior without the need for visible pressure. This subtlety is key to understanding why trade can function as a strategic instrument rather than simply an economic one. Although the ancient tribute system eventually declined as the global order changed, the underlying logic behind it did not disappear, but instead evolved alongside China's transformation into a modern state operating within a globalized economic system. Today, China is deeply integrated into international trade networks, participating in global markets, supply chains, and institutions, yet its approach often reflects a continued awareness of the strategic value of economic relationships. Trade partnerships can carry broader implications, where economic cooperation is sometimes linked to political considerations, and access to markets or investment opportunities can become part of a larger framework of influence. While the tools and context have changed, the fundamental idea that trade can be used to shape outcomes remains remarkably consistent. In the modern world, global trade has created a high level of interdependence, where countries rely on one another for resources, manufacturing, technology, and markets, creating both opportunities and risks. This interconnectedness can promote stability, but it can also create vulnerabilities, particularly when one side becomes significantly more dependent on the other. In such situations, economic relationships can be leveraged to exert pressure, whether through restrictions, tariffs, or changes in access, demonstrating how trade can move beyond cooperation into the realm of strategy. China's position as a major global economic power amplifies this dynamic, making its approach to trade especially significant in shaping international relations. A key reason why China's approach to trade is often misunderstood lies in the difference between historical perspectives. Where Western traditions have tended to emphasize equality between states and mutual benefit in economic exchange, while China's historical experience has linked trade more closely with hierarchy, structure, and long-term strategic positioning. These differing assumptions can lead to contrasting interpretations of the same actions, where policies that are seen as normal economic decisions in one system may be viewed as strategic pressure in another. Understanding this difference is essential to making sense of how trade functions not just as an economic activity, but as part of a broader framework of international relations. Ultimately, China's perspective on trade reflects a deeper understanding of power, where economic activity is not isolated from political objectives, but integrated into a larger system of influence and control. Trade shapes relationships, creates dependencies, and affects decisions, making it a tool that extends far beyond the marketplace. In this context, trade is not simply about goods moving across borders. It is about shaping the conditions under which nations operate. The idea that trade is always cooperative is, in many ways, a modern assumption shaped by recent history. But the broader historical perspective reveals that trade has often been used strategically, serving as a means of achieving political and economic objectives simultaneously. For China, this perspective is not new. It is rooted in centuries of experience, where trade was never separate from power, but an integral part of how power was exercised. So the next time you hear about global trade, economic partnerships, or shifting supply chains, just wonder, is this simply commerce between nations? Or is it strategy, operating just beneath the surface?